The one-world computer. A knock on the door. He opened his eyes and blinked them in the sunlight. Something lingered there in the blurry spots of his eyes, resting on the tip of his tongue. He rolled over and groped blindly underneath his bed, his fingers scratching for a pad and a pen. Already he was losing it. Something important, something he had to document. He touched his shoes, his discarded uniforms, and then the hard plastic of his computer. Parish, I'm going to let myself in. Parish turned his head as Truman walked in through his cabin door. Parish retracted his arm from underneath his bed and sat up. There was no use in preserving his memory now. He would have to keep his pad closer to the bed. Truman smiled as he sat down on the edge of his bed. He plopped a small sack down on the ground and patted it once. Parish's eyes went huge and Truman nodded his bald head. You got it? Parish breathed. He had his feet on the ground, leaning in to see. Oh, I got it. Truman's eyes sparkled. He was a big man, and his large stature and pressed uniform would seem intimidating for some, but for Parish, Truman was a gentle soul. He was the commander of their regiment, a drill sergeant, an overall brute, but between training exercises, he was as calm and kind as a child. He was especially kind to Parish, because Parish was the entertainment, and Truman the retriever. He could get things Parish couldn't. Truman extracted a small plastic cylinder from the bag, as small as a stone and as sleek as a sheet of glass. That's the Parcel 7. You weren't kidding, Parish said. He rolled the piece around in his hand. Internet speed is automatically 7 clips faster. We could get on China's register in under a minute and get second-by-second updates. Where'd you get this? I ordered it from the city, Truman said with a smile. Only Truman was allowed contact with the outside city, and every month he sent out an order for supplies, perishables, toiletries, etc. I told them I was using it for the power generator. We've been using that excuse for years. They think the sand is getting into the circuits and shorting our power. That breaker has never once shorted, and it's underground. I know, but my boss doesn't know that. He's never been out to this camp. He sends his delivery by every month with whatever I ask. But these parts you order, they aren't even compatible with a power generator. These are clearly computer parts. Shit, he doesn't know that. If he doesn't send me the parts, then I keep complaining, and he has to send an automat out here to get the generator. It's too much work, Truman said. No one seems to care about what we're doing out here, or else they'd check on us once in a while. What are you talking about? We have the running trials every couple months, Parish added. Sure, they send a scout out here 6 times a year, but how long does he stay? 2 minutes? I swear, they don't even check the damn kid's age. We could probably give him a 12-year-old, and he wouldn't think twice. That's not fair to the oldest runner, Parish replied. That's what we all look forward to, Truman. To get out of this desert and start doing something real. This isn't real. This is important. Truman beat at his chest with a forced mask of seriousness. We're soldiers. We're who the country looks to in times of trouble. Truman, there hasn't been a war in 1,000 years. I don't think there's going to be one anytime soon. All right. Maybe we won't see battle in our lifetimes, but we're disciplined. This is where blank slates are supposed to start. You learn discipline first, and then you go out into the world. What about compassion? Truman choked on his laughter. Didn't you get enough of that from your mom? I don't even remember my mom. Neither do you. Truman shrugged. Maybe I don't. But I know that I got enough time with her, as much as anyone else did. 14 months. That's enough time with the woman that gave birth to you. I see girls and boys flood into this camp every year. They're barely old enough to know who they are. Hey, that was once you, Truman said. Parish had heard all this before. You start with your mother, and then on to the nursery until you're 5. While the rest of the kids go to school, the blank slates are sent away to the desert. You gotta start somewhere. That's what everyone says, Parish sighed, but it's lost all meaning. How many years you got left? 5? That's nothing. Once you do your time, you move on to what you really want to do. Someday you'll be the greatest computer programmer the Akashic Records ever had. Parish smiled at this. Now aren't you going to try the damn thing? Truman asked. Parish retrieved the computer from underneath his bed and set it down on a pillow. They both gathered around it. It was as wide and thin as a slate of marble. The face of the computer was a slick sheet of glass, revealing the inner mechanisms of the device. a jumbled mess of wires and knob-like diodes. Parish carefully lifted the body away from the screen and replaced the current cylinder with the new Parcel 7. He screwed it in and hot-wired it to the battery. The computer started to hum and the projectors flickered with life. He replaced the screen over the body. "What's going on in the world?" Truman asked. "Let's see." Parish touched the screen and light filled the glass. They were now looking at a desktop of pulsating icons. Parish pushed one of the buttons, and just like that, they were connected to the internet. Right away, they were flooded with crawling ribbons of information, which they knew to be the news stories from all over the world, updated at every second and translated at their convenience. In the upper left corner of the screen, a list of names began to roll from top to bottom like credits. These were all the people that were currently connected to the internet, and Parish could chat with any one of them. "What's going on in Austria?" Truman asked over his shoulder. "Last time I heard they were sending a rover to Jupiter." "Here, I'll search for it." Parish tapped the screen and a new window popped up, complete with a virtual keyboard. Parish typed something in, and the news story blinked into light. "I still don't know how you're so good at this stuff," Truman said. "I've always liked computers." "Yeah, but how do you know how to build them like that? That's something you learn in school," Truman said. "It came natural to me." "But you're a blank slate, just like the rest of us. Where do you get these natural learned skills if you don't have a past?" "How many times are you going to ask me that?" "It makes me wonder." Parish opened the latest news story. He read the log line and skimmed the rest. "What does it say? You're supposed to read this stuff out loud," Truman snapped. "You know, I learned to read on this computer. So can you." "Don't have time. I have a job to do. I have 52 teenagers to instruct." "At least Cerise looks after kids. You think you have it bad? Try disciplining 20 manic 7-year-olds. Just read the damn thing." "Okay. Apparently, the Akashic Records has recorded its 9 billionth life this month. Can you believe that? 9 billion lives. And all of them private. My hope is to open one of these news stories someday and learn the Akashic Records has gone public." "What do you care? It's not like we have past lives anyway." "Yeah, but someday, thousands of years from now, we'll have past lives. And don't you want the freedom to see who you were?" Truman rubbed his chin. "I see what you mean, but people can access their pasts. It's possible. Only privileged people. Elite families. The average guy has to put his name on a waiting list for 10 years. Then he only gets some of the information," Parish said. "I mean, don't we have the right to know who we are?" "Who we were is more like it. But what do you expect? It's how things have always been. It's amazing that we even have that kind of technology. Babies are born still carrying a ghost of who they used to be, and we can plug them into a computer to download that information." Truman stared romantically into space. "I can't even begin to wrap my head around it. As a lover of computers, you should appreciate that." "Of course I do. I just don't understand why the records can't be public. Because everything is running perfect as it is now. I think a person should be able to see who they were and explore other skills they may have liked. Just because you were a doctor in a past life doesn't mean you should automatically become one in this life." "But it works!" Truman roared, truly agitated now. He got to his feet and stood over Parish. "If you succeeded as a doctor in another life, you'll automatically succeed as one in this life. And it's been proven. Every engineer in the industry is at the top of his game. Every teacher knows more than school can teach him. Every chemist, chef, artist, and politician is successful. And it's because they've already learned their lessons as different people." "Yes, but they were different people. Different people want different things," Parish cried. Truman threw his hands up into the air. "All I know is that this world is better off since we adapted the Akashic Records. Every country is now working together, and it's because we've formulated a system that works. Without religion or money, there's no need for conflict. Therefore, there's no need for us." "Don't say that. Those people are happier to know that we're out here, training for the worst case scenario." "That's what we are, the worst case scenario? What good can we do? We can't even train with weapons. If there was a war, it would be fought by autobots." Truman dropped his chin to his chest and sighed. Parish could tell the argument was over. They both took a deep breath. "Thanks for the part," Parish said. "You're welcome, kid." Truman checked his watch. "You'll be late for breakfast. We're hiking a 10-mile today. You'll need your strength." Truman turned around to leave and then stopped. He looked back at Parish, the tall, scrawny kid, only 19 years old and sitting cross-legged in his bed. And here he was, 35, so much older, yet somehow lacking, as if, even though they were both blank slates, Parish was so much wiser. Truman could never win an argument with him. "You know, when I was 25, I was different than the rest of you kids. All of you want to get out of this desert so badly, so you can re-enter the city. But when I was your age, I wanted to stay. I loved it here. I saw the city as my ending. I wanted to stay as long as I could, even if that meant I had to become the drill sergeant that I despised." "None of us despise you, though," Parish said. "Talk to me after the 10-mile hike." Parish readjusted the bandana over his mouth. The wind had picked up. The airborne sand felt like thousands of microscopic needles sticking to his face and neck. It was hot, hotter than usual. Maybe it was because the sandstorm was so heavy above their heads. It seemed to trap the heat like a blanket. The sun stood out like a red copper coin in the yellow sheen. Truman made his rounds, making eye contact with each hiker, giving him or her the eye, which usually commuted something like, "You're in shit shape." Tamara and Parish sat in the dirt, leaning their shoulders against one another. Tamara wore her khaki shorts with wool socks pulled up to her knees. Parish had decided to wear his hot uniform pants, mainly because the sand had the tendency to pelt his skin raw. Truman toured past them and raised his eyebrows. That was all they could see of his features, seeing that a scarf coiled around his neck and covered the better part of his face. He strutted off to visit the next group without a word. Tamara passed him the water bottle, and he lifted his bandana to swig off. "What else is going on?" Tamara asked him. She readjusted the brim of her hat over her eyes so that the shadow was long. She had fair skin and red hair. No one was more protected from the sun than her. The only exposed pieces of her flesh, her hands and neck, were coated in a dark red sun lotion, which had the same texture as adobe mud. "I don't know. You can get on the computer when we get back," Parish told her. "Did you see what's new with Halva?" she asked. "I didn't get a chance to surf around. Plus, Halva isn't my kind of publisher. Literature was never your sort. With faster internet, I can probably read back issues published 50 years ago. Halva's the oldest literary publisher in the world. You can trace it back to the beginning, all 700 years. If only Shakespeare and Carl Dickens had survived the crash, I might actually be interested." "Charles Dickens. What, would you rather we printed literature on paper? Barbaric," she said facetiously, nudging his arm. "We haven't learned it all from our mistakes. Our information is still ones and zeros. 700 years ago, crash, everything gone. Shakespeare and Jesus are only part of our mythos. Who knows if they actually existed? Shakespeare existed. As long as we can keep his greatest works memorized, then he will always exist in our minds. That's why we should make the Akashic Records public. So if the computer did crash again, then we would all remember who we were. It's the best kind of backup we could ever need." Tamara sighed and juggled the water bottle in her hand. "You're probably right. Once we get to the city, we'll start a campaign. We'll take to the streets and protest, like they did after the wars. And there's still money." 5 years for me, 1 for you," Parish said. She held out her hand and he kissed it. "I don't know. Freedom might change it. You could get to the city, get a job at Halva, and decide you don't need me anymore. 4 years is a long time to wait. I hear the older a woman gets, the faster the sex drive. Give me a break, Parish. It's not like we get a lot of alone time here." "I think the Oversoul were friends with Truman, or we'd never see each other. And even that's few and far. You may love the lifestyle out there in the Teal Center. Fresh food, mansions, schools, movie theaters. How can you be truly happy alone? Parish, please." She moved in close as he rubbed her back. Her hat toppled off as he dipped his nose into her hair. Before the hat could blow away, she quickly caught it. "If anything, this city's gonna scare me. All those automats rolling around, collecting trash and building bridges. It sounds spooky. You're still having those dreams, he asked her. It's silly, I know. Maybe I am still a little girl. The automats. They're sick of all the service jobs we make them do, and they're duplicating. Read stories on the internet where the automats can build themselves to increase efficiency. Think about how much they do. They pick and manufacture our foods. They produce the energy we need. They build our buildings and ship materials from country to country. If we didn't have them, we'd be lost. In my dreams, they revolt against mankind. They always find me. Parish sighed. I guess neither of us are getting much sleep. You're dreaming again? She asked him. Before he could answer, Truman's voice carried over the wind and pulled them to attention. All right, on your feet. We have until nightfall to make it back to camp. Follow the trail and keep drinking. They helped each other to their feet, watched the other soldiers swarm past them in cluttered clothes. Speaking of automats, these men moved like machines, their gazes fixed on some inconceivable distance, and their bodies set to autopilot to carry the passenger of their consciousness, curled up somewhere in the dark as if to die. How they were ever going to make it another 5 miles was well beyond Parish's self-assurance. They always did, bodies and all. After a dinner of carrots, steak, and potatoes, Parish had a few of the soldiers over at his cabin to see the computer. There was Parish's good friend Colt, Tamara, and a teenager named Jacob. Colt was a tan young man with wild curly hair and a prominent birthmark on the side of his forehead. He was the oldest of the group, 25, which meant he was qualified for the running trials. Now he was allowed to leave the camp and move to the nearest city, Teal Center, where he could finally pursue an education. Finally, he would get the chance to leave the camp in which he lived for 20 long years, ever since he was a child. Before leaving, Colt had taken a teenager, Jacob, as his friend. Jacob was only 13. He just recently graduated from the youngest class of soldiers, and was now introduced to an entirely new section of hard-bodied men and women with dry skin and even drier personalities. Parish could sympathize with the poor kid's apprehensive demeanor. Most of the older soldiers in the camp were not friendly, mainly because they were always exhausted. They were worked to the point of collapse, and there wasn't a lot of time to dedicate to the children, who were only looking for something or someone to idolize. Jacob hung off Colt like a fly, even inside Parish's bunk, huddled around the computer. He kept at his side, looking with wonder over his bony shoulders. Truman was not attending the party, although he had given them permission to meet. He was off in the children's barracks with Cerise, his lover. Cerise was the counselor of the juvenile camp, housing those 12 and under. Every night, when the teenagers were asleep, Truman would cross a short stretch of desert and meet her in her barracks, where she struggled to keep hyper-juveniles in their beds. He would help her to intimidate the kids into sleep, and then spend the night with her in uninterrupted peace. Truman didn't have to keep an eye on the teenagers in his camp. They were always tired, which made for a docile company that was easy to command. And if they did stray too far from their cabins, there wasn't a lot of trouble they could get into. They would never go out to the desert, since they were a week away from the nearest city on foot. People had tried to escape, but usually gave up and slinked back. Some even died, and if the girls snuck out to spend the night with their guys, like Tamara did almost every night with Parish, it was all right. It wasn't as if the girls could get pregnant, not until they reached their 25th birthday, when the birth control implant was surgically removed from their wombs. Can I see it? Jacob asked shyly. He was a mousy kid with red skin and soft flesh, a face partially obscured by a tangle of dirty blonde thickness. He had survived the 10-mile hike, which was the first of many for him, but he was wavering on his feet as though his legs were about to give out on him. You want to see the computer? Colt asked him with a weary smile. What would you look up? I don't know. I want to talk to someone in another country. I could do that, right? He said. Now that Parish and Tamara were staring at him, he blushed. He seemed to lighten when Tamara smiled. She sat on the bed with Parish, her arms around his neck. Colt sat on the ground with the computer poised under his fingertips. Tamara pulled away and motioned for Jacob to come closer. Who do you want to talk to? She asked. Colt passed the computer off to them and sat next to Parish. I thought this week would creep, but it's moving too fast, Colt said. I know, Parish replied dryly. What's worse is that you'll be replaced with just another child. I wish I could take these kids with me. I do. I wish I could take you with me. Colt frowned and crossed his arms. He watched Jacob as he played in the light of the computer. They're so innocent. I can't stand it. You were always pretty optimistic about this place. The desert was your playground. I always thought the work was too hard. Much too hard for a boy. If I didn't have Truman or Tamara or even this computer, I would have tried to escape years ago. Not until I met Jacob did I fully appreciate what was happening, Colt said sadly. I see how his childhood is made up of work and discipline, running, lifting, hand-to-hand combat. I watch as his spirit is broken under Truman's heavy presence. I don't know. Children should be better than this, but there's nothing to compare it to. You're almost out. If we didn't have the running trials, these kids would have nothing to look forward to, Parish said. At least they have something. What will I do when I get out there? Colt asked. Do you honestly think I'll be welcome? Instead of everyone else born with a silver spoon in his mouth, I'll have to prove myself. I'll have to work twice as hard in school just to be recognized. For what? I don't even know what I want to do out there. You're a great mentor, Colt. You could easily be a teacher. I don't know if I could teach those privileged kids while knowing there are children in the desert suffering back-breaking labor, without an education, without anything. Sometimes I think I should stay here with Truman. What? After all this time, you want to stay? Parish cried, sitting up in his bed. I don't know. He covered his face with his hands. You're scared, Parish said, patting his friend's arm. As sad as I am to see you go, you have to leave. This is all we've talked about for 20 years. As much as you always liked this place, you love the city even more. Even if it was just an idea, you can't give up on it. But I can help these kids. Here. No. You form the relationships here and then carry them over to the outside world, Parish said. You can meet Jacob in the city. Help him there. Teach him where it really counts. You can't help him here. This place is only the waiting room. Thank the Oversoul for your computer, Parish, Colt said, wiping his nose with his hand. Without that thing, we'd have no school or entertainment. Truman can't teach us anything more than how to survive 100 push-ups. At least the kids have this. We need to bring them in here, all of them. They should all get some attention. Parish grabbed his friend's arm and pulled him into a hug. Later, after everyone had left, Parish went into his bed with Tamara and dreamed. He dreamed that he was in a white room of light, and he was only a baby, screaming and bloody. But somehow he was watching himself from a bird's-eye view. There was his mother, pale and crying. The baby was not placed in her arms. He was carried over to a computer built into a wall. Men dressed in white placed the screaming baby on a floating slab of light. The light intensified, engulfing the baby's skin and causing him to squeal even louder. A set of wires extended from the wall and were placed on the baby's temples, and one on the back of the head. A series of images flitted past Parish's eyes, all of which he forgot the moment they left his vision, all except a single string of numbers, which reconstructed itself inside his mind, like it had done 1,000,000 times before. He knew the numbers were important, and he struggled to hang on to them. Then the baby was lifted off the slab of light, and the wires retracted back into the wall. Parish looked at the computer screen and saw that it was blinking with one bold word, unclassifiable. A blank slate, someone said, and the mother's face fell. The baby was placed in her arms, and she held it close to her breast. She peered into the baby's swimming eyes, as if trying to see something hidden there, something that was overlooked, something fleeting. Parish tore out of his sleep and knew at once what he had to do. This time he was prepared. He grabbed the notebook and pen from behind his pillow and scratched the number code onto a blank piece of synth paper. It wasn't the entire sequence, but he had enough notes to piece together. Trembling with excitement, he switched on his ceiling light, and Tamara turned over next to him, her eyes burning. He sat on the edge of his bed, ripping out pages and shuffling them together. What are you doing? Tamara asked behind him. He ignored her and sprawled out on the hardwood floor. shuffling the pieces into one cohesive puzzle. Tamara sat up and watched him, naked and shivering on the floor, mumbling feverishly under his breath. He ripped out a fresh piece and started forming a final number string from left to right. Then he whooped, and Tamara jumped with surprise. "Here it is," he screamed. "This is it. I know it." He showed her the paper, which consisted of a number code precisely 21 numbers across. 091263748136292058223. "What is it?" she asked. "That's me," he said, a little out of breath. He was in the process of extracting his computer from underneath the bed. "For the Akashic Records?" "Exactly. I was only given a few numbers every time I had the dream. The last 5 numbers were given to me tonight. The entire code appeared to me on a computer screen. This code. It was just a dream. No, it was more than that. I saw myself as a baby, Tamara. I saw myself being processed. The computer said I was a blank slate, but I saw my lives pass before my eyes." "What are you saying? That you do have past lives?" "I don't know. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I was never meant to be here. The computer doesn't make mistakes. It never has. Then I was the first." He fired up his computer and got on the internet. He searched for the Akashic Records and was forwarded to their member site. He found a bar to enter his identification number, which was only given to privileged people to access the database of their past lives. Every person was identified with a unique number code that he or she carried from life to life, but it was rarely ever shared with the person. He typed the code into the member login and pressed send. At first nothing happened. The screen stalled and then went black. Parish thought that it was his computer, so he quickly tried to disassemble the screen from the body, but halfway through the process, the screen came alive again. He sat back and watched, a smile on his face. Tamara pushed up beside him. "Can't believe it. You're in," she exclaimed. His biography was nicely organized at his fingertips. Parish, Rawdon, Seth. Sex, male. Profession, unclassifiable. Home, Lennox Camp. Cerebral states. Birthday, February 20th, 4031. Death date, pending. Cause of death, pending. "Why would they need to know how a person dies?" Tamara asked. Parish ignored the question and sifted through the material. There was another name just below his. Lyndon James Dietrich. Sex, male. Profession, unclassifiable. Home, Lennox Camp, Germany. Birth date, August 6th, 4005. Death date, May 6th, 4030. Cause of death, execution. "What is this?" Parish cried. "That can't be you. It must be a mistake," Tamara said. He scrolled down the list and saw that he had many past lives, both male and female, and every single one was tagged with the words unclassifiable and Lennox Camp, which Parish knew were the soldier training camps that blank slates were sent. There was a Lennox camp like his in every country on the planet, and it seemed like he had attended about every one. Even more chilling was that every one of his supposed past lives had been executed at precisely 25 years of age. The very last name on the list was the only exception. Hermit Peter Sundry. Sex, male. Profession, computer programmer / Akashic Records. Home, Teal Center, Cerebral States. Birth date, October 12th, 3332. Death date, December 5th, 3362. Cause of death, suicide. "I was a computer programmer," Parish said distantly. "There's no way." "I was a computer programmer here in the Cerebral States in our city. The Akashic Records keeps its headquarters in Teal Center. Is it possible I was a programmer for the records? The map is there. Hammett was born in 3332, 18 years before the records were up and running. This is my past, Tamara, or it should have been. Someone's been tampering with my results. They're saying I'm a blank slate when I clearly have past lives. This is the proof. Who's doing this?" "The real question is what happens to us when we leave this camp?" Parish asked, pointing at the computer screen. "Every time I turned 25, I was executed. Could that be the running trials? For what reason?" She was hysterical, scratching helplessly at her arms. "You need to get Colt," he said over his shoulder. "What?" "You need to get Colt right now. Hurry." With that last outburst, she flew out the door and into the night. Parish stooped down underneath his bed and quickly started to dress himself. The door slammed shut behind her, and seconds later it opened again, but not with the return of Tamara. It was Truman, and he was in a frenzy. His uniform shirt was half-tucked, and his collar was undone. His eyes were huge in the light of Parish's cabin, and he looked around the room as though he were expecting to find a murder scene. "What's going on? Why'd I just see Tamara running out of here crying?" Truman blurted. He stood tall next to Parish with his shoulders square and his head cocked. Parish couldn't help but withdraw up against the wall. His eyes flashed to the computer on his bed, and Truman followed his gaze. He gave Parish a burning look and then hovered over the open screen, tapping it periodically. Finally, his eyes found Parish, and they were about to sink into the back of his head. "The records? How'd you get into the records?" Parish brushed past him and sat on the bed in front of his computer. He turned it to the side so Truman could see. "Look here." Truman inhaled deeply and read the screen. He used his fingers to flick through the names, and with every life he scanned, the paler his face became, until he was as shaky as Parish. Truman pored over the documents for a long few minutes, looking up at Parish every now and then with a shadow over his face. Finally, he sat down hard on the floor with his knees together and his hands lying uselessly with his palms up. Parish studied Truman's downturned face, which was growing ever whiter, the veins standing out on his forehead as electric blue bolts of electricity. He didn't seem to be breathing, holding in his breath as though it was his last. "What is it?" Parish asked. "Truman?" Truman stood up with a mechanical cracking of his neck, staring at the door. He walked forward in a clunky gait, arms swaying limply. Parish called out to him once more, but his friend did not hear. He was already out the door, leaving it to clang absently against the frame. Before Parish could follow him, Colt entered in a crash, Tamara close behind him. He was just as distraught and tousled, complete with a pair of skivvies and a wrinkled shirt. He didn't say anything. Without a word, Parish held the computer out to him, and Colt reluctantly closed the distance between them. The next day Truman had disappeared. The previously scheduled morning and afternoon activities were canceled, and the teenagers were suddenly free to loiter outside their respective cabins, both rolling with misplaced energy for the next day, yet disturbed by the uncertainty of the turn of events. Word spread fast, and there was soon a line of girls and boys outside Parish's cabin. All 50 soldiers were waiting to read about the man with many lives. Not yet had they grasped the true altercations of what was happening. Only a few had real questions for the long-anticipated running trials every 2 months, and what might be waiting for them in the city. Was it an equal opportunity as a member of society, or a cold and tragic death? Some were angered by this prospect. The rest were hopeless. They filed out of Parish's cabin in the cold days, much like Truman the night before, not sure what to do with their looming information. Colt stayed outside Parish's room, acting as a mediator to the crowd, assuring the kids that everything was going to be sorted out, and they should return to their rooms to await instruction. Tamara sat on the bed with Parish, waiting as every young boy and girl made their rounds in front of the glowing screen, only to watch their faces screw up into disillusioned knots. And they would stand to leave in speechless sunder, grasping for answers, but finding none. Amazingly, Parish thought the 13 and 14-year-olds were handling the news rather well. It was the other soldiers, the ones who were already broken by hard labor and aggressive play, that took it the hardest. These were the ones that refused to leave the room. They demanded some kind of explanation. They bawled and screamed, threatening to smash the computer, only to be escorted out by the strong arms of Colt. Colt was quiet all that day, and Parish did not blame him. He was the next subject to leave the camp during the running trials. He only had a few days left, until he would be loaded up into the automat transport, never to see the camp or his friends again. "Maybe it's only a mistake," Tamara said for the 12th time that morning. "Maybe it's not," Parish replied. He remembered the troubling look that had come over Truman, starting across the room as if in a trance. Though many of the kids played with fantasies of Truman getting lost somewhere in the desert and eaten by a dust storm, most knew exactly where he must be. He was at the juvenile camp with Cerise, just a mile away, but that did not relieve Parish at all. Never before had Truman neglected to meet his kids in the morning. But why? It's so meaningless. Tamara looked at Parish pleadingly. My first recorded life was a suicide, Parish answered, looking away. What if this is their way of containing the untouchables, those people deemed socially degenerative? She stared at the floor hopelessly. And then execute you? How? Parish shrugged, surprised at his own aloofness. Same thing they do to people that break the law in the outside world. They have automats take care of it. Humane, lethal injection. They think you're damaged somehow. Like you'll make the same mistake twice in the next life? Well, there aren't many criminals in the world nowadays. Maybe for good reason. They're all neatly corralled into these horrible camps, life after life, Parish said. But suicide isn't criminal. It's not. Tamara shook her head. Do they even give you a chance to see the city before they do it? I don't know, Tamara. I'll refuse to go, Gold said in the doorway. They turned to see that he had been listening. He quietly ushered the teenagers inside, where they buzzed against each other in a bipolar dip of extremes, and then closed the door on them. He stepped back inside the dim cabin. Like Truman did. I'll choose to stay here in the camp. It's the only thing you can do, Parish sighed. But that means they'll pick the second oldest person to go. And he'll stay too. And then they'll keep going down the line. Not everyone can stay. Someone has to go, Colt. Colt swallowed hard, considering this. This is dangerous, Parish. What if they trace it back to you? Tamara asked. They must monitor that site, everyone that goes on it. I built this computer myself. It was never registered, he said. Still, Colt added, if they really want to find you, they'll find you. The door cracked open and Jacob bounded inside. I want to see it, Kid demanded. Parish had never seen the boy so heated before. He was usually silent enough to bleed into the background. I'm sorry, Colt said, hugging the boy to his hip. He got away from me. You shouldn't see this, Jacob, Tamara said, standing to approach him. See what? Jacob cried with tears in his eyes. They're saying the worst things. Let him see it, Colt. Might as well, Parish said. Colt stopped, considering. Jacob elbowed him and ran to the computer on the bed. Parish bent over to direct him, but the computer died in his hands. What happened? Jacob snapped. He went to shake the machine, but Parish pushed him away. Parish tapped the screen, opened the body, and fiddled with the components. It came back alive, but when Parish tried to regain access to the Akashic Records, he found that the web page no longer existed. That's strange. I don't know what happened, he said. Maybe the computer crashed, Tamara replied. You gotta fix it, Jacob bawled. Parish switched to the default web database, where all of the world's major internet controllers merged, but that page was blank as well. It didn't look like any other users were currently connected. There were no news stories to read or catalogs to reference. What does it mean? Colt asked, after a long second. I think it's possible the entire system might have crashed, Parish said, suddenly excited. Like the great computer crash of 3350? Tamara said. I don't know, he answered. That would be interesting. There were voices outside, loud voices screaming. They were progressively getting louder. The three of them barreled outside to find all 50 teenagers congregating at the edge of the camp, pumping their fists in the air and screaming at the peak of their voices. Off in the distance was the ghost of a dust cloud skating across the desert floor. That could only mean one thing. They were being visited. At the sight of a visitor, the screams of the children were usually those of jubilation, but in this instance, they were yells of anger. They were preparing themselves for a war. Colt got in front of them and tried to settle them down, but they were too far gone. Parish was just as emotional as the rest of them, but he didn't know what feeling he should cling to. Should he be furious? Should he be scared? He was certainly nervous. The running trials aren't until next week, Parish said, clenching and unclenching his fists, shaking in the sleeve cuffs of his uniform. Get back! Colt finally screamed, throwing himself into a wide tower before the onslaught of kids. I want you back now! Most of the teens filed back a step, but none of them tried to rush forward. Colt kept his arms spread for a long minute, and their cries of protest eased for the time being. He turned back around and watched the vehicle close the distance. They'd all seen it before. They knew it to be a desert rover, a sleek and compact hover car with a chrome body. Like all transport vehicles, it was an automat. so it could drive itself, but they also knew there was a running trial scout inside the cab. Every 2 months one of those rovers crossed the desert plain, and every time a man dressed in a khaki uniform claimed the oldest soldier in the camp. All the teenagers were watching Colt now, completely silent. They were all thinking the same thing. "They're early," Colt said. He seized up into one strained muscle, the gears turning furiously within his head. "You're not going with them," Parish said at his ear. Colt seemed to nod. "I've never seen them approach this fast," Tamara said. The rover skipped to a stop within a wide berth of the gathering crowd, and it stalled there, allowing for the dust cloud to settle. The door slid open and 2 men stepped out. One was dressed in the khaki uniform of a running trial scout, but the other man was well dressed in a long black trench coat, a corduroy vest and pants, and a long string of gold chains dangling from around his neck. He sported a black whiskered mustache, and his grown hair was slicked back into a ponytail and thrown over one shoulder. His eyes were guarded by a set of reflective blinders that took up much of his face. Parish could see the crowd's reflection in those blinders as he approached. "I am aware that this is an unannounced visitation," the man called, loud enough for them to hear. "But this is a peculiar set of circumstances. Hence, this is why I'm here. Verville Cole, the representative of the Akashic Records." His head moved from side to side, scanning the crowd of young faces. Parish held his breath and stepped back into the crowd of people, slouching as much as possible. "Our commander's not here," an older boy said near the front. "I know that," Serval replied without bothering to find the source. "He is who called me here, in fact. Well, the woman running the juvenile camp called after he refused. It is now clear that your commander has been illegally ordering computer parts, and he will answer for his mistake. The other camp is under lockdown, and I'm afraid it won't be opening anytime soon. Consider the same for this camp." "I am looking for a fugitive," Serval continued. He crossed his arms behind his back and stepped forward, while most of the crowd stepped back. "Ordinarily this is a matter for the police, but they do not know about this crook, and I'd like to keep it that way." "What did he do?" someone asked. "That's classified," Serval shot back, looking around for the speaker. Another voice, female. "What does this have to do with the records?" The scout stepped forward. "Enough questions," he growled. He crossed his thick arms and set them with a piercing stare. "I'm not going to ask you if you have any information on this subject, because you would only conceal information from me," Serval continued. He paced in front of the teenagers, who were now finding every excuse not to look into the stranger's face. They stared at their shoes or into the distance. No one wanted to see their own reflection in the strange man's blinders. "So I will be frank and begin. I'd hate to spend any more time in this wasteland than I need to. While we are here, let me ask to see the oldest soldier. Who is 25? No one spoke. Some of the kids shot trying glances at Colt, who was too busy studying his hands to notice. No one will speak up. There must be someone. There's always at least someone. Does no one care to leave? Still, an uncomfortable silence greeted Serval and his scout. "You see, no one turns 25 until November, so," a boy said, but Serval cut him off. "You're going to lie to me? Are you sure you want to do that?" He said this without addressing anyone in particular. He sighed, turning to look at his scout and back. "I didn't want to do it like this, but will Colt Paring step forward, please?" Every head turned to face Colt, standing a few rows back, and Serval picked him out at once. He pointed a gnarled finger at him. "Are you Colt Paring?" "Yes," Colt managed. He was still staring at his hands. "My records show that you are 25. Congratulations, son, you're free to leave." Serval clapped his hands, and he even managed a tooth-filled smile. "I don't want to leave." Colt finally looked up. Parish watched this from the background with Tamara at his elbow. A horseshoe gap appeared in the crowd as Serval stepped forward for a closer look. "Is that right?" Serval asked. "I'd like to stay in the camp and assist my commander in his instruction," Colt said, gaining confidence as he went along. "You are entitled to do so," Serval said. He advanced even closer until he was breathing on him. "May I ask why?" "I love the camp. I always have," Colt replied. Then who is the second oldest? He proposed this question to Colt more than anyone else. Silence. I can see where this is going. No one appears to want to leave. Is that so? Serval asked the audience. He received no response. He turned to his scout. Open the back. The scout hurried to the rover and triggered a switch on the rear. The backside of the vehicle released from the body with a whistle of air and folded into an automat with a circular body, perhaps 3 feet tall with retractable arms. At the ends of each arm was a pulsating taser, sparking with electricity. The automat rolled forward and came to a stop at Serval's knee. The crowd of teenagers gasped at the sight of the robot, and many scurried off toward their barracks. Command your regiment to stay where they are, Serval roared at Colt, who only blinked at him dubious. As quick as a whip, Serval struck Colt across the face, backhand, a red blush creeping up Colt's cheekbone. Colt held his face, eyes huge and mouth open. If you want to be the commander, then command them. Stop! Everyone stop! Colt cried. Everyone froze in place. Now, judging by the look on your faces, I trust that you all know what my little friend is. Small, yes, but the police in Teal Center rely on these contraptions to keep the streets clean. 1 shock keeps you comatose for 6 hours. 2 shocks and you're dead. Now that I have your attention, I'd like to call Parish Seth to the front, please. Parish thought that heads would turn again to pinpoint him like a spotlight, but everyone remained frozen. Tamara tightened her grip around his arm. Can I ask why you'd like to see him? Colt asked with a small tone. Serval had appointed him the commander of the camp, and that was what he had become, even though his shaking form did little to provide him the credible air of authority. If that will speed things along, Serval said. He is an enemy of these states in the world. He has jeopardized this country's private recordings, the very lifeblood that prolongs everlasting peace between nations. The supercomputer had to be reset as a matter of international security. All information, and most unfortunately, the Akashic Records, have perished. The consequences are unforeseeable. How could he be responsible for this? Colt ventured to ask. Serval chuckled, placing his hand on the automat's head, and a series of lights lit up on its chest. The automat completed a 360-degree turn and faced Colt. He didn't even have time to blink before a bolt of electricity reached across the 20-yard distance and crumpled him to the earth. The crowd of people screamed, and Serval threw his hands up to silence them. Jacob moved to sprint toward the front, but Tamara held him back, both of them too stunned to cry out. The automat faced the front again. Now, who else will defend Parish? Serval asked. Parish slipped away from Tamara and pushed to the front, her voice calling after him. Please, I'm Parish Seth, he said. Serval grinned, nodding slightly. He stroked his mustache, running his eyes up and down the length of Parish's body. You most certainly are. Thank you for coming forward. And now I must ask you to come with us. Where? Parish croaked. The scout was moving forward carefully. Just come with us, son. Not unless I know where I'm going, Parish said. He eyed the automat uneasily, ready to jump aside at any moment. I deserve an explanation. We all do. I trust that you're referring to the records? Legally, no. It is also illegal for a soldier to own a computer. Guessing it's your property? Parish ignored the question. What are you going to tell me? That it was only an error? Could have been. Depends on what you saw. I saw my past. Serval frowned. You should come with us before I arrest everyone in this camp for breaking the law. I could have this automat subdue them all in a second. The crowd drew a collective breath. You're going to kill me. I don't know who you think we are or where you're getting your information, but we are not murderers. You are a criminal and hacked into our computer system. You compromised our records. Nothing you saw was verifiable. You probably damaged the entire database. As Parish sucked in a breath to accuse the man of another lie, an electric bolt ignited and struck Parish in the chest. Like a cloth puppet, he hit the dirt and stayed there. The teens gasped. Tamara blew to the front, screaming in hysterics. Serval motioned for the scout and he moved fast, grabbing Tamara and holding her back. She shrieked, beating helplessly at the man's arms. Serval bent down over Parish, slipping his arms under Parish's legs and head, and lifted him up into the air. He turned around and the automat followed closely behind, the tasers still trained on the crowd. Tamara squirmed in the scout's arms. Finally fed up, the uniformed man threw her to the ground. She screamed, but stayed down, nursing an injured shoulder. Tears streamed down her face. Some of the others crowded around to help her. From somewhere Jacob began to cry. Tamara wanted to run to him and take him in her arms, much like Serville had taken Parish, but she was too weak to move. She watched as the back doors of the rover slid open and Serville poked his head inside. He deposited Colt into an unseen seat and pulled the door closed again. He strode back toward the idling crowd of teenagers, thinner than usual. Some had managed to sprint off into the commotion. Serville stepped over Colt's unconscious body without looking down, as casual as stepping over a rainbow. "Now," Serville called, "I would like someone to get me the computer in question. Hurry now." The crowd did not move from the ground. Tamara finally managed to crawl to her feet and sprint off while he wasn't looking. A trickle of people soon followed her. The automat's chest lit up like before, and its tasers cracked with electricity. "Someone had better get me that computer before I lose my temper," he continued. When no one moved, he roared like an animal and everyone jumped. "I am losing my fucking patience here." He nodded at the scout, and the uniformed man burst forward and grabbed Jacob by the scruff of his collar. Jacob yelped as the scout threw him into a deadly headlock. "You're gonna take me to the computer. Now!" Serville got in his face, pointing a deadly finger at his nose. Then the scout shoved Jacob hard to the ground, and the boy skidded across the sand on his hands and knees. He struggled to get up, blubbering to himself. "Leave him alone!" someone screamed. A young man threw himself at the scout, and before he could lay a hand on him, a lightning bolt knocked him out of his boots. The crowd quickly scattered into different streams of people, all racing back to their barracks. "Now, boy, go!" Serville kicked Jacob hard in the butt, and that got him moving. He tripped into a jog, headed for Parish's cabin. The scout was close behind him with the automat at his side. Serville walked back to the rover and got inside, sitting down next to the unconscious Parish and strapping himself in. Jacob opened the door to Parish's cabin, and the scout pushed him inside. Jacob bounced off the wall and landed in a heap on the floor. He stayed there, whimpering under his breath. The computer was on the bed, just as Parish had left it. The scout hurried forward and took it in his hands. Just as he turned around, Tamara crawled out from behind the door and leapt on his back. The computer spun out of his hands and skidded with the ground. The automat responded instantly by sending off a bright flash of electricity. The bolt struck them both and they fell to the wooden floor, lifeless. It turned toward Jacob, its lights flashing. Jacob continued to cry. His eyes closed and his head turned away. The automat stalled for a moment and then rolled out the door and into the daylight. A crowd of people were gathering outside of Parish's cabin. The automat ignited its tasers warningly at them. They saw the robot was alone and began to whisper amongst themselves. The automat continued to navigate through the thickening crowd of people. 3 different boys advanced on the robot from the rear, and 2 of them were struck down. One of the boys was able to grab onto the automat's head before he too was thrown backward like a doll. Now a dozen kids rushed forward. Another crack of electricity exploded and many of them fell. The crowd pulsed from all sides and there were blows raining down on the metallic body and kicks denting its armor. One of the young men was able to tear an arm off the robot like a bird's wing before losing consciousness in the process. A band of kids tipped the automat over and the other arm was dislodged. Now that it was helpless, the teenagers trampled it to the dirt, yelling and screaming wildly. Back inside the rover, Serville was busy inspecting Parish's sleeping face. Touching the soft skin on his cheek, deep in thought. Then there was a loud bang on the side of the car. Serville turned his head. His eyes widened as he saw a mass darker than the tinted window smash through in a spray of tempered glass. His door was ripped open and dozens of hands wrenched him out into the sunlight, momentarily blinding him in a whitewash clearing of his senses. The group of teenagers pinned Serville to the ground. One boy sat on his chest and the others held his arms and legs flat. Serval cried out in pain, whipping his head from left to right furiously. "The robot's dead," Jacob said with a grin, standing over him. "We answer to other people," Serval muttered out of breath. "If we don't come back, police will be here in an hour." "There's a radio in the rover," the girl said. She retrieved it and handed it to Jacob. It was nothing short of a cell phone with a wide speaker. Something that simple could only be a two-way. "Tell him to contact his boss, or whoever, and order a transport out here, for all of us," the teenager said, and everyone cheered in reply. "Yeah, do that," Jacob yelled, forcing the cell phone into Serval's face. Serval gave a strained smile. "You're going to have to ask nicer than that." "I got an idea," another boy said. He stepped forward with one of the automat's broken arms. The taser was still sparking. Jacob nodded his shaggy head and the boy started forward. All right, Serval cried. Jacob held the radio up to Serval's mouth. "Tell them everything's fine," Jacob said. "You need a transport to carry us out of here. Don't tell them anything, or we'll be sure to shock you twice." He triggered a button and the radio crackled. "Transmit," the male voice said. "Yes, this is Serval Cole of the Akashic Records, transmitting from the Lennox camp." Serval swallowed hard, and the teenagers tightened their grip around his arms and legs. All is right here." "Received, Mr. Cole, but this frequency is reserved for your attendant. Is he in the vicinity?" the voice responded. "Yes, he is. No, he's visiting with the sergeant. He asked me to contact you." "I see, although this is highly unorthodox." Jacob bared his teeth. An expression urged Serval to hurry. "About the kids," Serval began. "Change of plans. I'd like a transport set out here to collect them all." "That is impossible," the voice retorted. "We don't have the resources for that." "These are not my orders. They are above me." Serval grit his teeth. "Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand, Mr. Cole, but this is beyond my jurisdiction, I'm afraid." The taser sparked delightfully near Serval's head, sparks spotting his vest with dark burn holes. The kids snickered quietly behind their hands at the appearance of his buggy eyes, reflecting in the blue light of the electric fire. "Make it your jurisdiction," Serval spat. "This is Akashic business. Do you hear me? Don't make me go over your head, or I will make sure you're rounded up in the same cell with these fucking kids." "Very good, Mr. Cole," the voice replied with a faint quiver. "The transport will be there in an hour's time." "Signing off," Serval said, and Jacob killed the radio. "Thanks, Mr. Cole," Jacob said. He nodded to the boy. The boy came forward grinning. Over Serval's screams, the taser crackled. He went limp. The teenage soldiers cheered, throwing their hands to the sky. Parish was retrieved from the back seat of the rover, carried in the arms of a large 16-year-old boy. Someone made sure to pick up Colt, too, and they brought them to their respective beds, Tamara tucked in with Parish, each breathing low, their faces the serene images of peace, only a couple of dreamers with a long sleep ahead of them. As the three of them slept unawares, outside the camp came alive with celebration, rolling and wrestling with each other in the dirt, the girls dancing with the boys, some kicking sand over Serval's limp body to bury him alive with his scout. Others erupted in a mock sword fight with the detached automat arms, a group of onlookers standing by. A couple of the older boys fought over who would get to sit in the driver's seat of the rover, and they somehow got the engine running. They piled as many people inside as they could for a joyride, the driver tapping the touch screen behind the steering wheel. His passenger, a boy of 17, looked at the controls as they lit up in front of him, noticeably perplexed. He looked at the driver. "Where'd you figure this stuff out?" The driver laughed. "The internet." He laughed too. Outside, the soldiers erupted with a collective roar. The doors of the rover slid shut and the vehicle began to move by itself. Through the tinted windshield, the desert crawled slowly by. Then, with a jarring grip of G-force, the desert blurred and they were thrown back into their seats, sinking deep into their own bodies as the rover accelerated from 0 to 300 miles per hour in a second. It blasted into the horizon with only a ghostly trail of dust to show for it.